We're going to get started in just a few minutes, but we have a lot of yummy, yummy, yummy snacks over there. So if you feel the need for some energy, if you need a Rice Krispie treat or a s'more brownie, feel free to grab one, because otherwise I'm taking a doggy bag home. So get what you want. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Welcome to the presentation of the 2023 Katherine Schneider Journalism Award and the Gary Corcoran Student Prize for Excellence in Reporting on Disability. I am so happy to have all of you here with us, in addition to 6 of our contest winners. I feel like that's a record. So welcome, we're happy to have you. We are also live streaming this, and I'm hoping we have some people watching, some of your friends and families, as well as some of our professional colleagues from around the country. My name is Pauline Arrillaga. I'm a professor of practice here at the Cronkite School. I am executive editor of our Carnegie Night News 21 program. And I also serve as executive director of the National Center on Disability and Journalism, which, if you didn't know, since 2008 has called the Cronkite School its home. So it's been here for quite some time. And not enough students, as my colleague Nicole has pointed out, not enough students know about NCDJ. So I'm so thrilled to see some of you here with us because this is such important work. The NCDJ has one primary goal, and that is to provide support and guidance for journalists and newsrooms to expand and improve coverage of disability issues and individuals with disabilities. In my former life at the Associated Press, where I spent way too long, and since I've been here at the Cronkite School, I have always been a huge advocate of coverage and improving coverage of people of color and underrepresented communities. But far too often, people with disabilities get left out of that conversation. So we are all about trying to change that. And tonight, we get to celebrate some stellar work that goes a long way toward finally changing that. And I'm going to continue looking at all of our award winners as I say these important things tonight. The Katherine Schneider Journalism Award and the Gary Corcoran Student Prize are the only national journalism contests devoted exclusively to the coverage of disability issues. We are in our 10th year of awarding our professional prize, which is funded by Katherine Schneider, and this is the 2nd year we're awarding our student prize, funded by former Cronkite professor of practice, Gary Corcoran, in honor of her brother. Unfortunately, our donors could not be here with us tonight. Kathy, in fact, is in Mexico, but they did record some video messages to welcome you all. And we're going to hear first from Katherine Schneider. Katherine lives in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. She's a retired clinical psychologist who has been blind since birth. Back in 2004, I learned something new talking with Katherine last week. Back in 2004, she established an award with the American Library Association for children's books that best portray the experiences of people with disabilities. She told me after she did that, she figured out, oh, well, if you give an award, better stuff starts coming out. So she figured that this could happen with journalism too. So for years now, she has been an amazing supporter of NCDJ and of this important coverage. And guess what? Better stuff is coming out. So here's Katherine.
Greetings from Eau Claire. Once again, my hopes have been realized. There are more submissions, some great work by the judges to come up with pieces on vital issues like mental health care, housing of people with disabilities, and that intriguing piece on American Sign Language in social media. The pieces expose the general public to issues faced by the 1 out of 7 of us with disabilities and do it in a relatable way. Congratulations to the winners, judges, and to the NCDJ staff on another great year.
Gary Corcoran, our other donor, is a former Associated Press bureau chief for Mexico and Central America, also the former digital editor here at Cronkite for Cronkite Noticias. She also served as the managing editor this past summer for our News 21 program. She is a passionate advocate for student journalism and coverage of disability, and you're going to hear why. Here's Kathy.
Hello, I'm Kathy Corcoran, and it gives me great pleasure to congratulate this year's winners of the Gary Corcoran Student Prize for excellence in reporting on disability. I established this prize to honor my brother Gary, who died of pancreatic cancer in 2015. Gary used a wheelchair for most of his life, and he became a tireless advocate in the Phoenix metro area for accessibility. Among other things, he chaired the Mayor's Commission on Disability Issues, and he worked on other boards and commissions to make sure that public spaces and big public projects would be accessible to all users. His work affected the Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport, the Talking Stick Arena, and probably his biggest work was on the Phoenix light rail system. Some people say that this light rail system would not be as accessible as it is today without the advocacy of my brother. I have spent my career as a journalist, and so this prize gives me the opportunity to combine the passions of two Corcoran siblings. I know how important your work is. I know how important your stories are to bringing a perspective of people living with disabilities to a wider audience, to give the average person a view of the obstacles and issues that maybe they don't face in their lives, but that other people do, to bring empathy, to affect change. This prize is also an opportunity for me to honor journalism of the future by supporting and awarding student work. So this is a very special prize to me, and I'm very excited to see your work and to congratulate you, the winners of the Gary Corcoran Student Prize for Excellence in Reporting on Disability. Thank you.
So the award winners we are honoring this evening, and you can see some of their fantastic work here, were selected from 200 entries from journalists here in the US and across the globe, from places like India, Brazil, Uganda, Pakistan, Canada. That was a record number of entries, by the way, so what we hope that means is that even more people are stepping up to do this kind of work. So let's get to the fun part of this evening. As we announce the awards, we're going to ask our winners to come up on stage and then remain on stage for a conversation about their stories. I'll ask just a few questions to get us started, and then we're going to open it up to all of you. So I hope you have some questions. I like to plant seeds. Start thinking of questions now. So you have the opportunity. This is a great opportunity to pick the brains of these terrific journalists. Start thinking. By the way, we will do pictures after the ceremony, so we'll have you get your award, have a seat, and then we'll start the conversation. I would love to invite my colleague, Nicole Macias, up on stage. Nicole is a professor of practice here at the Cronkite School. She works in the Cronkite Agency, and this year, on top of doing that, she has also been contest coordinator for NCDJ, and she has been working tirelessly. That's my Texas. She is tired. I'm too. That's my Texas coming out since the summer. And I think that because of that work, that's one of the reasons why we got a record number of entries this year. So thank you, Nicole. All right. Professional awards are given in two categories: large media organization and small media organization categories. And they reflect a variety of mediums. So we've got print, digital, audio, video entries, and you're gonna see, you may already have, even some innovative illustrations. So in our large market category, first place goes to Beth Hunsdorfer of Capital News, Illinois, and Molly Parker, who at the time was reporting for Lee Enterprises Midwest for Culture of Cruelty. This was an investigative series that was produced as part of ProPublica's local reporting network. It uncovered abuse, neglect, and misconduct, to say the least, we'll talk more about this, at state-run facilities in Illinois that are supposed to be caring for people with mental and developmental disabilities. Beth and Molly, please join us. Thank goodness they work at the same place now, so they can keep that in their newsroom. Whew. Placing second in this category is former New York Times reporter Amanda Morris for an incredibly innovative look at how American Sign Language has been transformed by video technology and social media. Amanda is now a disability reporter at the Washington Post, and we are so, so lucky that the Post sent her out here to be with us today. Amanda, oh, and she's also a member of the National Center on Disability and Journalism Board. Come on up. Our third place winner is not in attendance with us. This is Christine Herman for her Side Effects public media story that examined the barriers families face finding appropriate mental health care for children and teens. This was a piece that was co-published by the Center for Public Integrity as part of a collaboration with the Carter Center that actually some of our students here participated in to help enhance coverage of mental health care around the country. The judges in this category also awarded a somewhat unusual honorable mention. This doesn't happen every year. And that goes to Ramita Saluja, a journalist based in Delhi, for a story about the prevalence of pelvic organ prolapse in rural India, where stigma makes accessing care a far, far bigger challenge. So congratulations to all of our large market winners. Now for our small market category. First place honors go to Caroline Gizolfi, Tony Plahetsky, and Nicole Foy of the Austin American-Statesman for Disabled and Abandoned, which found that the system of care in Texas for people with disabilities is beset by crisis and violence. Like other NCDJ contest winners, the Statesman took steps to ensure that this reporting and coverage was accessible to people with disabilities. We'll talk a little bit more about some of those steps in just a moment. And so here representing the team is Caroline, who is now a data reporter for the Houston Chronicle. So if we have any data reporting questions out there, Caroline is your woman. Second place is awarded to illustrator John Greiner for his comic story, Tales to Demystify Not Welcome Here. Published by Signal Cleveland, the series looks at accessible housing in Cleveland, Ohio, and explores what makes a home accessible for someone who uses a wheelchair or a walker. If you haven't taken a look at this, I would really encourage you to. Such an innovative way of, we can't say writing, of covering disability through a comic news story. Placing third in this category is Jennifer Dixon of the Detroit Free Press for Rights and Wrongs, which reveals how psychiatric hospitals and community mental health agencies in Michigan are somehow allowed to investigate themselves when someone complains that rights have been violated. John and Jennifer unfortunately could not be with us, but congratulations to all of our small market winners. And back for the second year is the Gary Corcoran Student Prize for Excellence in Reporting on Disability. We had many, many excellent entries. First place goes to Megan Gilmore for a piece she wrote while a graduate student at Carleton University in Ottawa. So Megan came from Canada to be with us today. Yeah, woo, yeah, Canada. Her winning entry ran in the publication The Walrus, and this is a fascinating story. It looks at criticism among people with disabilities over assisted dying laws in Canada. Megan, please join us. Thank you so much. Second place in this category goes to Julia Metro for a piece that actually stemmed from a climate change course that she took while at the Graduate School of Journalism at the University of California, Berkeley. The story, published in the Richmond Pulse, explains the effect of climate change on people with lupus. Julia, unfortunately, could not be with us. However, we do have another student winner with us. Placing third in this category are Aaron Gretzinger, Christy Klein, and Aaron McGroarty from the University of Wisconsin-Madison for a story that explores past, present, and future efforts, but also challenges to serve people with disabilities in Wisconsin. Erin Gretzinger is here with us tonight. Erin, thank you so much for being here. All right, let's hope those mics are working. Congratulations to all of this year's winners and to all who entered. Again, we've been getting a lot of entries globally, and I think that once again just shows how important this coverage is, not just here in the United States, but all across the globe. So we are super lucky to have 6 of you here with us tonight. You may have to share a mic. So again, I have a few questions for each of them, and then we're gonna open it up to you all for a while, so please think of some questions. Beth and Molly, I wanna start with you. I realize a lot of you in the audience have not had the opportunity yet to probably read some of this coverage. So as we're doing this, they'll describe a little bit about their stories. But I can tell you, I reread this again last night, pieces of it. This was a significant piece of investigative journalism that uncovered some incredibly disturbing behavior at these state-run facilities that are supposed to care for people, right, with disabilities, and did not. So you wrote of people being punched, slapped, hosed down, dragged across rooms, some instances and events that led to death. And one thing that really struck me was these facilities, and I hope I get this correct, have faced more state-run investigations than any other state agency, including prisons in Illinois. So that is saying something. I'm hoping that one of you can talk about what prompted this series from the outset. When I'm working with students, I often talk about the power of looking back, and I know that some of these cases were years old, and people had been looking at these agencies for some time. So how did you decide to do what you all did and take such a comprehensive look at this? And feel free to, again, to briefly describe the entire series, Culture of Cruelty.
We started looking, there were a series of arrests of people who worked in these facilities. So I started sort of digging into it, and at some point, Molly and I kind of crossed paths, and she was working for the Southern Illinoisan at the time, and then she went to work for Lee, and I kept hearing her name, and I was like, so I just called her up one day. I didn't even have permission from my boss, really. I was just like, hey, do you want to work together on this? Instead of so we started looking at these old Office of the Inspector General reports, and one of them, Blaine's case, the one that we featured in the day one, that case was really old, but none of the parties that were accused of it have been charged with anything. And a lot of them had been on leave for drawing a state paycheck for years. Wow. And they had started businesses, and they had other jobs, and it was just and nobody had spoken. And basically what happened to Blaine, which was he got held down and just abused, just punched and slapped, and he was while he was restrained, and there was blood on the wall. I mean, and this guy he has a pretty profound level of autism, but he's higher functioning, and but he still he sleeps with a teddy bear. So that's where we kind of started, and there were lots of 26 people who were charged with felonies out of these facilities. So wow. That's how we kind of got started. I'm gonna pass it to Molly.
That's amazing impact. And Molly, I want you to just carry on with that. But I did want to also ask, and you might want to take this one, what some of the biggest challenges you all experienced in reporting this were. I mean, you all did, of course, you continue to look at this issue and at the repercussions and what's been happening. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, these are state-run facilities, so we had access to some records through the Freedom of Information Act, which is pretty strong in Illinois, compared to some states at least. It's not perfect, but we were able to get some reports. But because these are medical facilities, there's a lot of privacy around facilities like this, as there should be, right? That you want to know that you have some degree of privacy if you go in for treatment in a mental health center, developmental center. So there were challenges to getting records because the state can use that privacy angle to sort of deny you certain records. The Office of Inspector General for the department that runs these is where we obtained a lot of records, but they would only, under state law, provide the records if they substantiated an employee for the abuse, which means that they indicate, like they found that yes, the evidence showed they did it. But what we found were, and there were a lot of terrible ones that were indicated, but what we found were that a lot of cases were not necessarily disproven. They were falling into a gray area where they said, well, we cannot reach a conclusion. And those records were sealed under FOIA. They weren't accessible. And so I think that was one of the biggest challenges we faced, because we also knew that there was this culture of cover-up. So all of that was working against us because the employees were trying to cover up these cases, and therefore the Inspector General, because the employees would lie, literally, if there was an incident, everyone was in the bathroom. Everyone was out on a smoke break. I mean, it was almost incredible how no one ever saw anything to explain why somebody had black eyes, injuries, broken bones. So we had to come up with some creative workarounds to get at the ones that were covered up.
So how'd you get them?
We had internal sources. Yeah, you want to take that one?
Yeah, we're lucky. We had developed some internal sources that kind of pointed us to what we needed to look at. And in a couple of instances, we were able to talk to like family members, because, I mean, these people are vulnerable, and they're also rely on the care of the people who are abusing them, right? So it's difficult for them, if they can, to come forward and tell what happened to them. So, and what she said is true. There is like an incredible network of, an elaborate network of covering up and covering for each other, because these workers also, if there's a behavior and you're the one who's the whistleblower, and you get in a situation where somebody's having a behavior, nobody's going to come help you. So it kind of was self-perpetuating and ingrained, and they found incredible ways, like they would text each other and be like, what did the cops ask you? I'll tell you what the cops asked me. And it was just very organized, it almost seemed, and ingrained.
Interesting. Thank you. And I hope within some questions we can come back to this. This is challenging because there are 6 of you who have amazing stories to talk about today. So I'm going to move on. Caroline, you're up next. So your series and that of Beth and Molly felt familiar in incredibly unfortunate ways. Can you talk a little bit about this Medicaid waiver system in Texas and what your story described as this skyrocketing need for care for disabled people? So I'm going to share just a couple of tidbits from her work. One piece talked about how nearly 160,000 disabled Texas residents are waiting up to 17 years for disability services in their communities. A Democratic state representative said, quote, "Everything is broken. Our legislature remains in a crisis-responsive mode, plugging holes in a dike to avert disaster." I don't even know where you want to start, but what are you seeing in your state? And I suppose what then is the larger takeaway here in terms of how people with disabilities are being treated or not treated by these state agencies?
So we looked at essentially the alternative system to institutions. In Texas, around the 1980s, they developed these waiver programs that were supposed to essentially be a solution. They thought that by providing smaller settings, people were going to get better, more personalized care. They weren't going to be victimized as often. The costs were going to be lower, which also meant that more people were going to get care and that workers were going to get more opportunities and higher wages. And what we found is that on all of those performance measures, Texas failed. When it came to better care, because they had these smaller settings that were managed by kind of a middleman, these private companies, a lot of times they didn't provide the right standard of training, which meant that people were not getting better care. There was rampant abuse and neglect, by some measures just as much as there was in institutions. And the system was not providing more care to people because Texas did not actually transition from institutions to the second system. They were paying for both at the same time. So prices went up, fewer people got care, people were waiting decades for care, and they were getting denied over and over and over again. We're talking about people that sometimes only had a few years to live. And that also meant that the workforce was left with very little funding and oftentimes was in unsafe situations or created unsafe situations. So unfortunately, the system that was supposed to be a solution ended up being very similar to that system that in Texas was also incredibly problematic.
So this was, when you get the chance to look, another incredibly exhaustive and extensive investigation. We have several investigative journalists and aspiring investigative journalists in the audience. What advice would you offer on how best to go after or stay after a story such as this? Maybe, and you are a data reporter, maybe some of the tools that you all used to uncover what you did.
Sure. I would say be incredibly persistent. In our case, we were almost starting from zero. Institutions had been reported on quite a bit. The waiver system, not so much. So we had to start requesting records from the state that a lot of times no one else had requested before. The state didn't even know if they had them. A lot of cases they didn't. One of the main challenges that we faced was finding people who had actually experienced a lot of these abuses that we knew about. The state, again, for similar confidentiality and medical confidentiality reasons, would not give us their names. So that's where data tools came in. In our case, we used a program that sorted through tens and hundreds of thousands of lawsuits, and we looked for specific companies that we knew were providing these services to pull out lawsuits from a lot of these victims. We ended up finding hundreds of these lawsuits, and that's how we pieced the story together. If I can give one other piece of advice is just be open-minded. When we started this series, what we were looking at was mostly lack of care and accessibility. And the more we looked into it, the more we realized that everything about it was broken, just like a lot of lawmakers ended up finding out. Just like a lot of people weren't getting services, the people who were getting services were not getting the standards of care that they deserved. So the scope of the reporting expanded more and more the more we reported on it.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to Amanda, and I'm so glad that you could be with us, in large part because your story is so different. When we talk about journalism focused on disability, and I talk about this a lot when I do training sessions for journalists, we're often focused on the horrors because unfortunately there are so many, right? I mean, we're uncovering terrible things day in and day out. But there are so many other ways in which we can write about and cover disability. And this is a far different kind of story, and I hope everyone doesn't mind, but Chris, could you just put the link up for 1 second, because I think it helps to see this visually a little bit. We're gonna hope it works. And Chris, if you're able, there you go, to scroll a little bit. Okay, so Amanda, what drew you to this story? And I know that this is a little bit of a personal story for you, so can you also tell the audience a bit about that?
Yeah, so I am actually a child of deaf adults. Both my parents are completely deaf, and I have a hearing loss myself. The reason I started doing this story is actually kind of funny. I was on the train with my mom, and we were just signing back and forth to each other. And we bumped into an interpreter because it's a small world, and if you see somebody else who knows sign language, you always want to say hi. And those are the kind of things that people don't always know about, like different kind of disability cultures that are out there. Like the deaf world is really vibrant and really small and tight-knit. And we were talking to the interpreter for a while, and maybe midway through the conversation, he started making fun of me. He was like, "You sign like an old person." And I thought that was quite funny. And I was like, "What do you mean?" And he was like, "You must have learned sign language from your parents." Thank you. He was like, "You must have learned sign language from your parents because, you're using really outdated, like, older folk signs. And I was like, what? And that kind of stuck with me, and I wanted to learn more. And he was teaching me some of the new signs along the way. Like, for example, right behind me, you'll see the sign for dog. That's the one I was using, which apparently is the old people's sign. And apparently all the young, hip, deaf people use a smaller sign that looks like this. That's a play on the letters D and G in American Sign Language. And I just really wanted to learn why. Luckily, there are a few ASL linguistic experts who agreed to talk to me for this story. And the whole premise of the story is that essentially, as technology has evolved, younger deaf people are using smartphones, right, to talk to each other over video phone. And they're like holding their phone with one hand and trying to sign with the other hand. So it's a lot easier if your signs are a little smaller. And if you're trying to do a 1-minute TikTok, maybe a little faster. Whereas in my parents' generation, you would only be able to use ASL face-to-face. There wasn't video calling back then. So signs used to be bigger and just outside of the box, quite literally. And that's really changed with computers and smartphones. And I just thought that was really fascinating, and I wanted to do a story about it because you so rarely get to look at sign language and how it evolved as a language. I feel like most people look at it and they're like, oh, that's cool. Like, how do I say this word? And that's it. And it's like, no, this is like a whole history here. This is like, people are using it. It's like a living language, right? And it's about the people who use the language. It's not just about the signs themselves. So I had a lot of fun reporting this story.
That's just amazing. Thank you so much. And Chris, thank you for putting that up. I really, really appreciate it. And again, I think I told Amanda this, I use this story now every time I do a training on disability for newsrooms, because we've got to think outside of the box, whether it's reporting on disability or, again, reporting on communities of color. You know, you don't want to just cover the doom and gloom all the time. Again, we need those stories. They're very, very important, but there's such a breadth of stories that can be told. And by the way, Amanda was the first disability fellow at the New York Times. This is just going to get on my soapbox. This is another reason why we need more journalists who have disabilities out there. So thank you so much. I'm going to move on, but I have other questions that I'm probably going to come back to, so put that one in my back pocket, okay? Thank you. Oh, let's go to our students now. Megan, you first. I don't even know where to begin with this story. So this story takes an absolutely different look at assisted suicide. I think most of us think of assisted suicide as something that, frankly, a lot of people would advocate for, a lot of people would support. This story takes a look at it from the perspective in Canada of people with disabilities. So in Canada, I'm going to use air quotes, the medical assistance in dying laws are very different and very unique than I think what we would think of as assisted suicide here in the US. I'm gonna cite a quote. The title of the act is Medical Assistance in Dying, but these aren't people who would otherwise be dying. We're not just assisting them, we're actually making it happen, which is very different. Okay, Megan, I know that this is super complicated, and I'm gonna ask you to keep it brief because we gotta get to Erin too, and then open it up. This is complicated, but can you briefly tell the audience how these so-called MAID laws are affecting people with disabilities? And what was the response to your story? Because it's really disturbing.
So I'll start with the first question.
Okay.
I'm going to try to do this as quickly as possible. I know lawyers and legal experts who have dedicated years of their lives to studying this issue. If you want to know more, come talk to me after. I can put you in touch. So what was then known as physician-assisted suicide was legalized in Canada in 2016. That's when the law became effective. And at the time, it was restricted to individuals who have what the criminal code in Canada refers to as a grievous and irremediable medical condition, which would be a disability, an illness, or a disease. So disability is in the criminal code. But it was restricted to individuals whose, quote, natural death was reasonably foreseeable. Now, and this is a thing we get into in the article, those words aren't defined. There is no set definition of what a naturally, reasonably foreseeable death is, and it's widely interpreted differently. But essentially, what people believed it was is this is for people who are dying. Okay, so like you have terminal cancer, something like that. In 2021, Canada changed the law and removed the requirement that somebody's natural death be reasonably foreseeable. So that now means that in Canada, under the criminal code, individuals who have a grievous and irremediable medical condition, which would be a sickness, an illness, or a disease or a disability that is in an advanced state of decline, so it's not going to get better, are able to die by what we call medical assistance in dying when they're not dying. So the argument from the disability community from the beginning of this has been we need that requirement for naturally reasonably foreseeable death. We need it to be a quote-unquote end-of-life restriction, because without that, you're opening the door to anyone with a disability to be considered eligible for this under these nebulous terms in the criminal code. And that's what has happened. The most recent numbers actually came out a few weeks ago. We can get into that later if you want. But that's really the crux of it, that right now in Canada, according to the criminal code, it is better to be dead than to be disabled. And that disability in and of itself makes one eligible to receive what we would normally call physician-assisted suicide.
And Megan, what are the numbers?
Oh, friends. I would just like to say I'm usually a happy person, okay? Usually I try to make jokes, which is really hard to do on this story. So new numbers came out a couple weeks ago in advance of my birthday. Thank you, Health Canada. I'm legally blind. I've been legally blind from birth, so my birthday is also the anniversary when I acquired my disability. In 2022, 13,241 Canadians died by MAID. That's equal to 4% of all deaths in the country. Of that, more than 400 were individuals who were not facing a naturally reasonably foreseeable death, so they weren't dying. Since 2016, 44,958 individuals have died by MAID.
Not even really sure how to follow up on that.
No, all I could say is we are your largest neighbor. And I understand that in different states here, you are having these conversations. So Canadians spend a lot of time bombarded with American news. We are heading into 12 months of it. So excited. We love you all. But I think it would behoove you all to pay as much attention to some of our healthcare legislation that we do to what happens down south.
That's a good piece of advice. Erin, I feel like I'm going from the depths of despair to Erin, can you talk a little bit about the piece you all did? But I have a short question actually. Why has Wisconsin been a leader in disability rights? That was interesting to me, but can you tell people what your piece was about? And then, so we're talking about all these other states and then what's happening right now in Canada. What's going on in Wisconsin?
Yeah, so our story was for the University of Wisconsin-Madison's Curb magazine, and our magazine created an editorial philosophy, and for us it was Pulse, and the idea was to find what's driving the state forward, what's holding us back, basically taking the pulse of issues, different issues, life in Wisconsin. And me and a team of 2 other writers had settled on covering or taking the pulse of disability rights, issues, joy in the state. And we decided to do that by looking at its past, present, and future, because those are very different stages, as our story points out. And it also, I was having a conversation earlier today that with these other amazing journalists, that really does capture an evolving sense of disability as well, with the past really focusing on a legal conception and what that meant. And that's what we really mean when we talked about Wisconsin as a leader, that this is not the part of the story I wrote, so I'll keep it brief. But the general idea was that Wisconsin was a legal leader, right? We were on the forefront of implementing some ADA policies and really getting up to code in like the official sense. However, that's not the full picture, which is why we felt it was important to continue telling that story. And looking at the present in Wisconsin, part of what motivated us to look at this topic was there was a lot of conversations happening around long COVID at the time we were writing this, as well as very specific to Wisconsin, the banning of ballot boxes. There was a huge Supreme Court case in the state, which was surrounded by, people with concerns about election integrity, basically pushing through to the Supreme Court a law to ban ballot boxes, saying that this was a way to commit election fraud. And in reality, that set off alarm bells across the state for disability activists, because ballot boxes are a key tool in that arena. And we followed some of the plaintiffs in that case, the lawyers on the case, and it actually was appealed, that decision, which was, a big journey for Wisconsin. But we looked at those present day challenges, since that revealed a lot about what is this conception. We were once considered this legal leader, right, and then to the present day, being on the forefront. I think the lawyer in the case said it was one of the most important disability rights cases in the country at that time, and that people all over the country were looking to what that ruling would be, because it could have had dire consequences if it hadn't been appealed. And then we did want to take a little less doom and gloom look, and we specifically, and this was another motivation for the piece, right on our own campus, we had a bunch of different students who were organizing to create a disabled student center. And as a cultural space, there's a lot of different cultural spaces on campus, I'm sure there are here, but that was noticeably missing for a lot of students with disabilities at UW-Madison. So we talked to a lot of those students, like why they felt this was important, really talking about identity, what this space would mean, and yeah, they just officially got their own space. They have permanent staff now, so lots happened in a year. Since that was the early formation, so the school really responding to those students and creating a space for them. So yeah, that's the story and the evolution of it.
I love that framing vehicle, past, present, future. So we are going to open it up to you all. I hope some of you have some questions. We do have a microphone here in the center of the room. Please don't be shy. You're here at Cronkite. None of you are shy. Come on. So come on up if you have any questions. I want to throw one out while I hope someone's coming up to that microphone to ask a question. And that is, Amanda, can you talk a little bit about some of the tools and technology that you all use at the New York Times? Well, pardon me, that you all did use when you were at the New York Times to make stories more accessible to people with disabilities.
Yeah, actually, is this, okay, cool. This is really important for all of you guys to remember as you move forward in your journalism careers. You should think about every type of reader, not just a reader who looks like you or behaves like you. One thing that's really happening right now in the news industry is a bigger push to have the stories themselves be more accessible. One of the easiest ways to do that is to have alternative text on your stories. And that's essentially, and I'm sure that Megan could explain this way better, it's essentially when you have an image description that will show up when somebody has a screen reader, which is essentially like a technology that will read everything on a page out loud to somebody who's blind or has low vision. And it's super important, especially if you have a really visually driven story, especially if you have things like graphics or just explainers. Those are really important visual cues and information that add to a story and add to your understanding of a story. And it's pretty easy to do, and a lot of people don't do it. I'm also a huge proponent of captions on every video. I mean, how many of you guys watch Netflix with captions, right? It makes it easier for everybody, not just deaf and hard of hearing people like myself. So as we move forward, we're also trying to think more about ways that new technologies like AI can potentially be used to also make stories more accessible. A really good example of this is Amy Silverman did a piece with ProPublica where she used plain language. And for those who don't know, plain language is essentially writing in a way such that somebody with an intellectual or developmental disability can more easily understand the article without using words that might be beyond a certain reading level or really complex explanations, but still gets the story across. And so she did a really cool piece with ProPublica using both plain language, like she had a plain language version and then she had like her regular written version. And I do think that like AI could be a really interesting tool to try to convert more articles into different reading levels, Spanish, different languages. I mean, I don't know why newsrooms aren't doing it yet, but it's something I'm pushing for. And I think it's something that if you guys go out in the world and you push for it, you'll sound really smart, first of all. But also you'll just be making your work accessible for that many more readers and you'll get that many more clicks.
Yeah, and absolutely. Whether you're a journalist in the audience or you work in digital audiences or communications, thinking about this is the way forward. So you all can be advocates for this with your bosses as well. So happy to see that we have 2 questions. Please introduce yourself and if you'd like to say what you're studying here, go for it.
Hi, I'm Sonia. I'm a senior at Cronkite, studying kind of in the middle. I'm doing journalism and digital audiences to get both sides of the picture. And Amanda, I actually really appreciated when you said that disabled communities have their own respective cultures. I felt really represented in that moment. And that got me thinking about my question, which is, disabled communities have their own, respective cultures and practices. And sometimes there can be a rift between what authority figures on the subject, let's say the most common one is medical professionals, might say about living a healthy lifestyle with your disability. And then there's the actual lived experience of having a disability. And so my question is, how do you find a credible expert to a disability story? And what do you do when the doctor may be wrong?
I think
That's a good one.
I feel like a couple of us could speak to this, but I'll start.
Go for it.
I guess 2 parts to that. First off, I think anytime I'm doing a disability story, especially if it's not my own disability, if I'm like covering, because like it's such a diverse and broad community, I actually talk to way more people than end up in the article, which always kind of sucks for all the people that don't make it, but it actually really helps me with my understanding of a topic. So sometimes, like with long COVID, I think I interviewed like 20 people the first time I did a long COVID article, and then like 3 ended up in the article, but then the other 17, I was like, thank you so much. Because like, how do you know? Like, there's just a lot of diversity in the experience of even one disability. And then when it comes to experts, obviously any story you do, talk to at least 3 experts, because they're all gonna say different things. But particularly with disability, there's this weird dichotomy where people in the news industry tend to turn to doctors and researchers as an authority on disability, and almost trust that more than the perspective of disabled people themselves. And I think the best analogy I can think of is like for years, the journalism industry trusted police on what happened more than they trusted Black and brown communities. And it's only really recently that we're starting to shift that and be like, we're not just going to report based on the police report, because the police report is sometimes wrong or blatantly lying. And I don't think we should automatically trust doctors and researchers either. Not saying I'm vilifying them either. I talk to a lot of them and I love talking to them because I think they're really smart, but they are not the only voice of authority and they don't always get it either. I've talked to so many people, even on like hearing aids, like I wear hearing aids, and I remember talking to a hearing aid researcher and like they develop hearing aids, and the way they develop hearing aids is often to prioritize the sound of human voices over all else, which makes it really annoying because it actually dampens sometimes the sound that you want to hear. If one person's talking, you're like, now the other sound's ruined. And they think that that's because that's what I want to hear above all else. But sometimes I don't want to hear people talking. So things like that, and it's like, so I think just keeping in mind, like, doctors and researchers are not always the authoritative, like, answer on everything. And even if you are talking to them, you should talk to at least 3 and talking to, like, as many people as you can with a disability. And it doesn't even have to be that you're wasting their time and talking to them like a bunch. It could just be like 15-minute calls, or it could be like that you're like really lurking on like online spaces and like being like, what are they all saying out here? Because a lot of disability communities, and I use plural because there are lots of different factions, are like very online, which is really helpful for a reporting aspect of that. And then last but not least, I do think that this also happens where even within disability, and I definitely know that Megan can talk about this, there are like divisions, but then whoever is the loudest sometimes gets taken as like the authoritative voice on it. And this happens a lot in like various like, I don't want to name any specific disability communities, but there are specific ones that I'm like, oh, that really happens, where it's like this one person's perspective becomes like the dominant perspective, and then like an outsider thinks that that's what they all think. And it's like, actually, there's a lot of diversity in this, like even in the deaf community, there's a lot of disagreement about things like, you know, whether or not we should initialize signs, like whether or not we should bring English letters into our signing, or whether people should have cochlear implants or hearing aids, and so many debates. I hope that helps. Does anybody else want to add or take a crack at it?
I have one quick one. So if you get all of these conflicting viewpoints, how do you tackle that then in your story? Is the suggestion transparency? You show that there are conflicting viewpoints? Or how do you pick and choose?
Yeah, I would say yes, and I kind of want to pass to Megan here because like
Yeah.
I think she did have a lot of conflicting viewpoints in her story.
Thanks, Amanda. Yeah, I would agree with that. The transparency of saying, so I'm going to use my story as an example. Sorry to make this super depressing, everyone. But let's say I'm interviewing you about what in Canada we call medical assistance in dying, and you tell me that you have concerns about it. I'm going to get very specific with you, because I want to know, do you have concerns about the whole thing? Did you have concerns about expanding it to individuals who are not dying? Do you have concerns about what Canada is planning to do in March, which is expanding it to individuals whose only medical condition is a mental illness, right? So getting very like specific, but then also saying that in the reporting. So if you read the piece in the Walrus, there's several individuals who we quote who have serious concerns about the state of Canada's laws around assisted suicide, but they actually agree with assisted suicide in certain cases. So being very specific about that, I think, is helpful. It can also be helpful, and I think some people don't like it when I say this, but I think sometimes it can be helpful to actually describe what somebody's disability is and how it impacts them on a day-to-day level. So I am legally blind. That phrase means absolutely nothing on its own unless you're actually saying what I can and cannot see. So I think that can be helpful to help people understand that in one diagnosis, there's going to be a huge range of experiences and impacts. If you have any friends who have spinal cord injuries, like huge differences depending on where your injury is. So I think being specific about what the nature of somebody's disability is in a way that's appropriate to the story, but also getting down to the specifics of what their actual concern with the policy is can be really helpful.
That's amazing.
Yeah,
And
I
that's
wanted
just
to-
good reporting, specificity.
I was going to add one more note, because this was something that actually came up after our reporting in a conversation with the source who was interviewed by another one of the writers, but was actually a friend of mine. We were talking about medicalization in stories about disability and how, and like actually this was like her personal preference. She's like, I don't like saying my diagnosis to reporters, but that's usually one of the first things reporters ask. And because that diagnosis, like I think you just pointed out, specifically like with spinal cord injuries and certain types of disabilities, that doesn't actually capture necessarily like this huge umbrella of lived experience. So really being like just cautious about nuance and like taking the time to dig in and know it, like go in being super, like I think we say this all the time in journalism, but I think actually like living it out can be more challenging sometimes, but you don't know it all, and pretending you know it all usually means the story is much, much worse. So really being vulnerable to the fact that you don't know everything and being honest with people, like, can you tell me what that looks like? Tell me what that feels like for you. Like, I want to understand. And coming from that point, like the story, like that was a big thing for me after. I'm like, I didn't necessarily consider that on the front end that now informs my reporting going forward.
That's a fantastic suggestion, and also a suggestion, great suggestion for a question. did that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Hi guys, my name is Morgan Casey and I'm a master's in investigative journalism student here, actually working at the Howard Center down the hall. My question for you guys is, how did you tackle sourcing on these stories, particularly given that it's such a sensitive and vulnerable community that has really been negatively impacted by not only news media, but also entertainment media for like hundreds of years. So how did you get people to trust you with these really sensitive stories and sensitive experiences?
Sure. Okay. Thank you for your question. We featured several people, but we did have difficulties accessing people again because getting names, and we also found that a lot of times, like in the community we were writing about people with intellectual disabilities, parents wanted to speak for their adult children, and that was something we had to navigate because we believe, the parents had their children's best interests at heart, but it wasn't their experience, right? And so they might be telling it through what they view. And so we really worked very hard to find people to talk to who lived in these facilities and had experienced particularly the abuses it showed. We found a young woman who we featured, who we found her name in a court case. That's how we came to know her. And we really wanted it to be her decision to be in the article. At first she had wanted to do it, but without a name, or a first name only, and we had talked about doing that. We worked with her for an entire year. I think I talked to her almost every week, and then toward the end, probably 2 or 3 times a day. And we wanted to make sure it was her decision. I think that was the main thing, because she went through some pretty horrific things as a child that had gotten her there, and then experienced some things inside the facility. And so I think that was just really important that we didn't try to rush it, and that at the end, before the story ran, I talked to her for probably an hour a day over a couple days, where we went over everything that was attributed to her. I mean, not necessarily the rest of the story, but anything where we negotiated, what details of your life are you comfortable sharing? Just because somebody tells me, every detail doesn't mean they want the world to see everything. So we wanted to be honest, but also respect that, you have a right to know what's going to be said about you in that private way. And afterwards, she was really glad she did it. She did it with her name, and but it was definitely a long process.
Yeah, and of course, that's not incredibly usual, is it? To go over in detail some of what's going to be included in a story, but sometimes when you're writing these stories, that's something we've got to think about and change as journalists.
I think mostly you show up, you're patient. A lot of times there's not, when the parents would say, oh, that we want to have our child, we want to have easy access to them, they live close to us, but I wouldn't want my mom and dad picking where I lived. And they're adult people, right? Everybody grows and everybody changes. So if they weren't able to make it in a group home when they were 18, it doesn't mean that they can't make it when they're 30. So, I think sometimes you have to, like she said, navigate the parents' wishes with maybe what the individual's real wishes are. So, and sometimes that's a little difficult, especially because we did have a little access. I went to show myself and visited people there. It's, I think it was pretty underestimated, the ability and their ability to be able to say what they wanted. So if you show up and you just listen.
We have
I think this
a couple of more minutes, but go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
No, you're
This is
fine.
a great question.
And if anyone else does have any other question, we are at 6 o'clock, but I love questions from our students. So if anyone else, get in line. Go ahead.
Yeah, also, you can always reach out to me. I will respond, especially if you say that you were at this event, and I'll be like, oh, cool. I think a couple things come to mind. First of all, I think we talk a lot about parachute journalism, and we talk about that a lot in terms of location, and we don't talk about it enough in terms of communities. If you're parachuting into a community, I think it's pretty apparent sometimes, like you just kind of introduce yourself weirdly or ask weird questions off the bat. And so the more you can educate yourself before you reach out to somebody from a vulnerable community on what the kind of culture is, or like what is or isn't okay to talk about, or like trying to avoid like the kind of, lack for a better word, like the questions that might be a little off-putting, that will go a long way. But then also, like, I think just as somebody who has lived with a disability my whole life, I love talking about my hearing loss. I love talking about my deaf parents. And there's a way that I love talking about it, and then there's a way I don't love talking about it. I love talking about it when it just kind of comes up and things. I don't like talking about it when it becomes like the sole focal point of like, this is all I know you as. So I think when you are particularly interviewing somebody with a disability, obviously like the disability sometimes is going to be part of the story. You're going to want to ask questions about it. But I also think it's important to talk to them about like other aspects of who they are. And like I spent like a day last week with a woman who's blind for like a story I'm doing, and I can tell you like, her whole story of like why she loves Monet, and like the times that she's been to France, and her love of cooking, and her extensive cookbook recipe, things like that, or her extensive recipe collection. I think things like that, like just showing that you are viewing them as a whole person rather than just as a marginalized member of this community. You know what I'm saying? Like, I think that goes a long way too, like just literally having a conversation with them. And then I think the last thing is that, particularly with disability, people tend to tiptoe around it, and they're not really sure how to ask about it. And they're like, oh, like, what's going on with your ears? Or like, and I'm like, okay. I think it's best to just be direct and be like, what's your disability? What does it impact? How do you do this? Like, just ask in a way that's not awkward, because the more awkward you make it, the more awkward they're going to feel, and the less they're going to want to talk to you about it. I hope that helps. Oh, and wait, the last thing I was going to say is this, I think this goes doubly true if you're a member of two different marginalized communities. So I know, like, I'm also sensitive to that when I'm like interviewing somebody, like, for example, if you're Black and you're disabled, there's like a criminalization of disability that happens in like Black and brown communities that doesn't really happen in like white disabled communities. And you really have to think about that as you're approaching your reporting, that there's going to be really different perspectives. And to get at the other question, always make sure you're interviewing not just white disabled people, because that happens a lot in the news. And I think it's starting to change, but I don't think we're quite there yet.
Thank you so much. Anybody else want to? I don't know if we're at time or not. If anyone has anything else to say, go for it.
I guess the only thing that I would add is the standard interview that you would do with any source isn't necessarily going to work. So show up in the sense that ask, this is about, people with disabilities, people who have suffered abuse. A lot of times those two intersect. Not everyone's going to be comfortable, even if they are verbal, talking to you over the phone. Maybe they're not even comfortable talking to you in person. We had some sources who initially only felt comfortable writing a small essay or writing us some text messages where they slowly processed what they went through and what they wanted to highlight. Eventually we moved on to phone calls. Eventually we went to their homes. We spoke with people who were nonverbal but could communicate with body language and tablets. In that case, we ended up spending extensive time in their homes and allowing them to get used to our presence. In a lot of cases, with some disabilities, people might not be comfortable with anyone besides their immediate family. Don't rush that process. Allow them to see if they can get comfortable around you, and if they can't, don't pressure it. I think, again, just try to be open-minded, don't parachute in, and be sensitive to what someone else might be going through. You're not just trying to make a deadline, you're trying to highlight someone's story, so let them tell their story the way they want to.
And then I would add, this is all great, y'all did a great job. So I'm going to assume, which I know you shouldn't do, but I'm going to assume that someone out there, one of you have a disability. So when I'm reporting a disability story, I disclose that to the sources. And one of the reasons I do that is because often my stories are actually about disability policy, particularly social assistance. And I am a recipient of government social assistance. I've been for most of my life. So if I'm gonna ask somebody, how much money do you get from the government on this ridiculous disability pension, I lead that with, I'm about to ask you a question that might sound really rude and uncomfortable. So I just wanna let you know something about myself. I'm currently a recipient of the Ontario Disability Support Program. And they'll be like, oh, and sometimes you have to navigate this, because there have been times when people are like, I thought you were my friend, not a journalist, and it gets all weird and creepy. But this is something I've had to learn a lot, is you just have to be a lot more vulnerable about your own experiences. And if you have a lived connection with disability, that really can help people be like, okay, and I tell them, I'm still a journalist. I'm here as a journalist doing my job. I want to understand, I'm coming with some knowledge. So, sometimes it gets to be a little more conversational. There'll be a bit more you're telling me this story. That reminds me of this thing that once happened to me. Has anything that ever happened to you? Okay, what was that like? So you're bringing in your own experience with it and helping them verbalize it. Because one of the things, and Amanda maybe will speak this too, I was born with my disability. I know no other way of living in the world. So it can be actually really difficult to try to describe it, because I'm describing to you air to me. I'm describing to you just the basics of my life. I don't know how to do that. So sometimes it can be helpful to kind of help give people prompts.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Morgan.
One last quick question. I'm Nicole with NCDJ and helped plan this. We have a little poster on the side with a QR code for the students to actually scan the style or the guidelines from NCDJ. And I was just wondering, how do you all, have you used them? How have you referred other people to them? And how could it be beneficial for the students here in the audience?
Did anybody else want to start? Or I actually do use them. I like double checking myself a lot. I double check myself a lot. Always double check yourself. But I think they're really useful because the explanations of some of the disagreements are in some of those, which is actually really helpful, because then you can kind of make an educated decision about which one's the most appropriate to use in your story. Very clear example is in the deaf community, some people prefer to capitalize deaf to signify it as its own distinct culture, and some people prefer lowercase deaf. Even my own parents, my mom uses capital, my dad uses lowercase. And when I talk about both of them, I use lowercase because it's more of the umbrella term. And that means that sometimes in my stories, I'm switching between capital and lowercase deaf a lot. But if you go to that entry on the NCDJ style guide, it'll explain why some people prefer one over the other and sort of how you can use them. I think it's a really good thing to use. I think there still needs to be more. There's a lot of different things that you can write about that it's just hard to cover everything in one style guide. But yeah, I think it's interesting because I think even the AP style guide is starting to catch up, and maybe they've been talking to you guys. Yeah, anybody else want to?
So
I was just gonna say, I don't remember. It might have been your guidelines, but correct me if I'm wrong. But I was trying to look into to learn. I knew the general contours of person first versus identity first language, and that being a pretty basic debate, I suppose, in the scheme of things, and asking people how to go about that, and making how to reflect that in your story. I know my student newspaper now, we are at the University of Wisconsin, the student newspaper, at the beginning of a story, we'll have a disclaimer, and this story uses person, identity first versus person first language. Some people so navigating some of those nuanced conversations, I think. It sounds like
and
that's a
just
good
in
way to
case,
do it.
and I think we have one more question, and then I promise y'all, thank you. I promise we're going to wrap it. I'm so grateful to our events folks for hanging in there with us. Person first language, a person with autism, disability first language, an autistic person, in case you didn't know what that meant. One more question?
Yes,
our final.
Okay. I'm Hudson. I'm a master's student in sports journalism, and this is for Molly and Beth. Now, your story seems so big that I was like, I don't even know where I'd start. So how do you take such a big idea and turn it into practical steps that actually help you make progress on such a story like this?
The Chicago Tribune helped a lot. We were into our reporting and we found out that the Chicago Tribune had put a reporter on it. So we had to hit the gas pretty quick. And that's why, and now, like, in print culture and digital culture, the news agency we work for goes out to 400 newspapers, so it's going to be printed somewhere. It's kind of better to take it in chunks. It's better for the reporting, it's easy for the writing, it's better for publication. So we got our story out, like we gassed it and beat them.
Yeah, I mean,
That didn't slow you down? No,
it sped us up. Yeah, I mean, and you know, organization is huge. I'm sure everyone can speak to that. Like, as we were getting, I don't know how many records we went through at the courthouse and elsewhere. You know, we use Google Sheets, which is real basic, and that way because we don't work in the same place. So, hey, you know, yeah, we're logging everything. Anyone you've talked to, you know, like breaking down your records in a way that you have sort of the cliff notes on them quickly. Yeah, and then I think thinking through pieces, like at first the first story we wrote was not our first draft, right? It had all kinds of other things in it, some of which then became story 2 and 3, because, you know, people don't want to read longer is not always better. I mean, I kind of came up with, like, we got to shove all this in here and like write the 8,000 word story that no one's going to get to the bottom of. So I do think just like thinking about it as, and working with a good editor is huge. So we had 3 good editors on this project, and certainly our editor at ProPublica that was very good at like, okay, we've got these pieces now, so let's hit the publish button, and these other things that, you know, should be developed out into other stories. And so when you look at it like that, it's not a huge project. It's one average size story at a time.
And it does drive you a little crazy because you're leaving great things on the table, right. And you're like, but we always were able to come back to them. Like, we're going to use this about the guy who had the semi-automatic rifle, and like, we're going to be able to use that in story 2, or we're going to be able to use that in story 3. So like, there was a lot of reporting done, and not all of it came out in the first story.
Thank you so much. So I'm so glad that Nicole mentioned our website. Actually, Chris, do you mind on connect with us? There you go. If you haven't gone to the NCDJ website, please do. If you don't know what Nicole was talking about, yes, we have a disability style guide that desperately needs to be updated, and we are working on updating it, and I'm going to enlist Amanda. And yes, we are working with the Associated Press to continue updating their style guide as well. Please, 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 please connect with us. This is such important work, and this is work that all of us should be doing. I want to quickly thank all of you for coming and hanging in here with us. Thank you, all of you contestants. Thank you, if you're out there in the virtual world, to all of our judges. Special thanks to our ASU events team, and Chris, thank you for hanging in there with us. I'd like to thank the NCDJ graduate assistant, Molly McCarthy, who did an awful lot of work to help prepare for this. And last but never least, I wanted to thank Nicole one more time, because Nicole has just been a huge, huge help for NCDJ since the summer. So thank you. Have a wonderful night. I am so appreciative for all of you hanging in there and for your great questions. And thank you. Let's do pictures.